series, Systems Change in the Arts. It's emergent conversation. We are talking in ways that we're very passionate about the need for systems change, and we're not very practiced at it. So that's really an invitation to everybody to get involved in the conversation, because we believe we all need to practice. And it's the way that this session is going to work is that Gurkham's going to lead the first part, which is a reflection on the neoliberal conversation we had last week. And then we'll launch into the conversation today, responding to the ecological emergency. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Deborah Hart and Dr. Kim Liu, who we'll be having that conversation with. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I've already said that if you need captioning, then please let us know in the chat for the breakouts. And that this session is being recorded and it's live streamed on YouTube, just so that you're aware. Once this session is over, the recording, we edit off the breakout parts, and then it's available for people to watch. So just so that you're aware of that in terms of your own interaction. And we've imagined this as a collaborative space where people join in the conversation. So I hope you're up for that today. And I'm going to pass over to Gurkham.
Hi, everyone. I'm zooming in today from the unceded lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders and community. Last week, we had an interview with Jessica White, Associate Professor of Philosophy in the School of Humanities and Languages at the University of New South Wales. And we invited her on because she's recently written a book, The Morals of the Market, Human Rights and the Rise of Neoliberalism, which draws on detailed archival research on the parallel histories of human rights and neoliberalism. Jessica really helped us understand neoliberalism, which led into discussions and breakouts about how this way of thinking impacts the arts and what we can do about it. So I just wanted to recap a couple of the points, and then it'd be great to hear any reflections from those people who were here last week, or any thoughts from people who are just here today. So some of the key points that Jessica looked at were neoliberalism's push for competition in every aspect of our lives, the complete reliance on the market to solve everything, and that neoliberalism has a requirement for a kind of blind faith or an absolute submission, almost religiously, to the unknowable market order. We spoke about how these things relate to the arts. Some of the main points that emerged were artists being pitted against each other to compete for resources, with the idea that the market will bring the best artists to the top. The rise over the past few decades of the professionalization of the arts, so the rise of marketing and fundraising and producing and curating in the arts, which solidifies artists not having access to people that are employing them. And then we also spoke about the top-heavy arts organisations, where those in administrative or management roles often have full-time positions and artists are sort of at the bottom of the rung. And some of the things that came out of our breakouts, where we talked about how, what we in the arts can actually do about this, what are some actions we can take. I'll just quickly recap some of those things. So we spoke about resisting the trends rather than serving the market. We spoke about education from a young age and how important that is. We spoke about different funding models, such as a lottery system, some of which has been trialled around the country recently. We spoke about artists infiltrating boards, as lawyers and accountants have infiltrated arts organisations. We spoke about making art that's not saleable, but also has other social impacts. We spoke about exposing neoliberalism as much as possible. Arts organisations possibly being run by councils, becoming Creative Commons, getting more empowered in the political space, joining other activists and learning from social media. So using those tools that exist to engage young people. So that was a bit of a recap of what we spoke about last week, but I'd love to, for those of you who were here, have you had any thoughts that have emerged from the discussion last week? It'd be great to hear if you've got anything that you wanted to share. Just put your hand up if you'd like to share, or I might call on you if I remember that you were attending. I can see Israel is there, and you were here last time. Did you have any reflections from last time about the discussion? Any thoughts that came out of it?
I'm not sure if anything. Hi, everybody. Sorry. I'm zooming in from the Wurundjeri country of the Kulin Nation. And I Not sure that I have something directly relating to last week's conversation, but just in general, I think that there's something to do with the law and that we need to maybe pay attention to, that this systemization of the arts also has to do with the legalization of the art. So also the elimination of the art potentiality to be radical and groundbreaking and edgy and outside of the norm, aka the law, in a way. That's just a thought.
Great, thanks, Israel. Thank you. If you have any things that you'd like to talk about that came out of last week's discussion, or any thoughts or points of discussion, please, as I said, raise your hand or put it in the chat. Pippa, was there anything that came out for you that you wanted to, or any reflections that came out of last week?
Yeah, look, I want to pick up on Israel's point, and I think for me, because as some people may know, Israel has a kind of connection to Europe, as I also have. Well, the UK, which is no longer in Europe, but anyway, we'll leave that for the moment. And having spent so long in the UK and then coming back to Australia, it was really striking to me how rule-bound we are. So it just, that idea of the artist as the person who's allowed to sit on the outside and be asking difficult questions, and with some flexibility around the law. And I think certainly in Britain, when I was there, I think it's changing, and working in the street arts world, it was the artists who were noticing the change in police laws. It was the artists who had sort of some flexibility and are recognised as having a role in that space. And that it feels quite different to Australia. So I don't know if that's useful. I will also, for those of you who follow me on Facebook, I've been doing a few 4 a.m. ideas because I've not been sleeping very well. And one of them was all about trying to advocate for art centres to become commons places. And what might that look like to kind of campaign to local councils to almost take them out of the asset based way in which the council looks at all property and say, well, actually, this should be an art space for perpetuity, and what does that mean legally? And, you know, just as an exercise, I think that'd be quite interesting.
Thanks, Pippa. Yes, Nancy.
I wasn't here last week, unfortunately. And just for those of you who don't know me, despite my accent, I have lived here in this country on Wurundjeri land for more longer than most of you have been alive. And for most of that time, I've been working in the arts. A couple of things. One, to follow up on just what Pippa has just said. I was part of a webinar last week with regional art centers. They were all
Oh, Nancy, you've frozen for us for a second.
They were, oh, have I unfrozen?
Oh, yeah, unfrozen now, yeah.
Unfrozen. I'm just going to move my computer because it might get me to a better place. The regional art centers are facing a dire dilemma over the next 2 years of basically of how to survive and how to change. And they are beginning to look at seeking different ways of surviving without having to fulfill the expectation that they will have many bums on seats, because that's not going to happen. And they don't have a whole bunch of ideas yet. And they are looking for them. My problem when these subjects that came up are so vital to all of us. They have been around for decades. And when I first began in the 70s working in the arts in this country, by and large, we worked without pay. And then we got a share of a box office if there was one. We were almost by choice outsiders, but it was also, that was our expectations. And there was, you know, out of that came the Pram Factory, La Mama, extraordinary work Circus Oz, just a whole bunch of, for their time, very, very radical pieces that could not have happened if we had been having to follow laws, and that also dared to put themselves outside that holy grail of viability, which is, as we all know, those of us who have made 10,000 grant applications, that is the holy grail. And, you know, it all comes down to a space that we know as artists we need to live in, and which is the outsider, the prodder, the questioner, the challenger, the confronter. And that yet the expectation is that we will be able to support ourselves through our art. Or are we going to go back to having other jobs and do the art when we have the time? And that gradually, as you all know, means that older people, people with families, people who have mortgages, yada, 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 cannot participate. So it's a very challenging situation. And one of the questions that I have longed to put to the Australia Council in particular is, how are you going to make sure that the arts can continue to take risks? How can you enshrine the act of failure so that we see that not as a sign that we are bad, but that we are taking risks, that we are breaking boundaries, that we are going through new doors? And if we don't do that, our culture is going to die. It will wither on its stalk. And I don't know that there are any good answers to this, except we have to keep doing what we're doing.
So I would like to pick up on that, Nancy, and I'm just about to put a link in the chat, which is to David Pledge's work on the universal basic income, as one way of, and I think it does a number of jobs. It obviously advocates for artists to be paid a universal basic income, but it also then suggests that we align with others who need that, and that then takes us to build relationship with some of the disadvantaged people in our society who desperately need a basic income. So that feels like quite an interesting solution that people are campaigning around at the moment.
Thanks, Pippa. And I mean, maybe let's put that question that you've just raised there, Nancy, to the floor. I mean, are there other models or ways people know of that the arts can continue to take risks, deal with the law, and continue into the future? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Robin.
Yes, Robin. Yes.
Robin from Ngunnawal Country, aka Canberra. I suppose I'm in the interesting situation of having kind of quite recently been, well, directing a company which has quite recently been growing quite fast in the last few years, and of suddenly being overwhelmed with the amount of bureaucracy that is involved in being larger than 1 or 2 projects a year. And going from being one of the people, you know, one of the independent freelance artists who criticize art centers for overspending on, you know, on managers, to going, we have to employ more people in the office because there is just no way we can keep the funding bodies happy and fit inside a regulatory framework without a whole lot more hours being devoted to that. So I suppose one of the things I'm really interested in is models of sharing administrative burden between multiple organisations. I think Duck for Cover is an extraordinary model of like a success story in Australian arts of, you know, for anyone who's not familiar with it, of, you know, an organisation that exists for the purposes of providing public liability and other insurance cover for its members. That, yeah, I mean, it is a fantastic model of, which I understand originated from a bunch of street performers trying to solve the problem of being faced with $1,000 a year public liability bills. But I think, yeah, models where there can be more I don't want to use the word centralized, because I mean, yeah, I suppose, but where resources can be shared for around accounting, insurance, and those things to decrease the burden on individual small organizations and freelance artists.
Sorry, I was laughing because Nancy and I haven't seen each other for some time since we set up Organised Chaos, which was 3 organizations, which were basically, you know, a few independent artists with a board, each of the 3 organizations. When we tried to set up this model, exactly what you're talking about, where we shared all of the administration and all of the bureaucracy. Do you remember much about that time, Nancy? We didn't succeed, but we tried.
You're on mute, Nancy.
Still on mute, Nancy. Yep.
I remember it all together too well because I still have all of those files. And we went to Creative Vic, and Gurkham at the time was head of the Melbourne Workers Theatre, and I'm head of Black Hole Theatre, and we were working with anyway,
also going to have a mental blank.
Yes. And we went to Creative Vic with this idea. We were independent, struggling companies. We wanted to share whatever we could, equipment, possibly office space, possibly producers. And they made us jump through hoops like you would not believe. We had to get it, you know, properly risk assessed. We had to do this, we had to do that. And it was quite obvious that they were trying to delay us into submission. And we kept answering their demands. In the end, they said no, that it had never been tried before, so they couldn't do it. That was their reason. And yet now, when you talk about economy of scale, when you talk about how are we going to work together more productively, how can we begin to share ideas? And Victoria is, you know, the Artists Here Week, sure, we compete like crazy, but we're incredibly supportive of one another as well. And it just makes so much sense. So much sense.
Can I also say that having sort of moved over to the social services, it would make so much sense here too. You know, like actually it's not a particular problem in the arts. It's a problem of turning every single individual into a business. And the growth of the kind of consultancy, which is absolutely rife, means that all these little individual businesses all investing. I don't need to tell you the story. I'm sure you can see the parallels.
Well, I think we should put that as an action to explore how we can do this better. Maybe not go to funding bodies next time. We've only got like half a minute left before we move to the next part of today. Does anyone have any final comments they'd like to make before we wrap up the discussion around neoliberalism? Of course, though, we can never wrap that discussion up quite, can we? I'm sure it will bleed into today's conversation. Any final comments for anyone? Yes, Alex, yeah. Yes.
Sorry, I completely dropped out for the last little bit, but was just listening to what you were saying, Robin, and yeah, that's where I kind of lost you all. But it seems like that's really intimately connected. That kind of admin burden and all of that is intimately connected with what Israel was saying before about legality. And so it's not just about kind of feeling radical in the making, but it's actually the structures within which we're operating, which are so tightly sort of prescribed. And I was talking to Gurkhan last week and realized that, you know, I first started working in the arts in a company as a performer that had 5 full-time artists and 1 kind of, you know, 3-day-a-week administrator. And then 10 years later, when I left that company, there were no artists employed at the company. And there was an administrative body of something like 6, 7, 8 people. And pretty soon after that company, you know, well, it's still journeying, but yeah, it's, but yes, so I feel like accepting those burdens is also a bit of an issue, you know, like share, yeah, we can work out how to share them and distribute, and that's another interesting kind of approach. But yeah, anyway, just a connection there. Thanks.
No, I'm glad you brought it up, Alex. I was going to bring it up for you if you didn't mention it, so thank you. Thank you, everyone, for recapping that discussion. And as I said, I'm sure we will continue to mention various elements of this. I'll hand over to Pippa. Thank you.
Thanks, Gurkham. So we're going to move swiftly on to the mother of all crises and talk about how we respond to the ecological emergency. And I'd first like to start by welcoming Dr. Kim Liu and Deborah Hart to this conversation. I'd like to start with you, Kim, in terms of I felt that it was a fantastic opportunity to bring a general practitioner into this conversation, because the first time that I heard you speak, I was so overcome by how your view of the impact on your patients and the body was really has really led you to activism. So would you like to share some of that with us, please?
Yes, can you all hear me? I live and work on the land of the Darug Nation. This land has never been ceded. And I'm a senior doctor where I work. So I graduated 31 years ago. So I've been practicing in medicine for a long time. And in the past 12 months, climate change has become an abstract concept to strike people's every sense of who they are, where they are, so that the air you breathe, the water you drink, the food you eat is impacted by climate change. And I think that hit home to so many people in the past 12 months. And we have to remember, health is just not an absence of disease, and that the mind and body is an integrated unit. I can't talk about the health of the body without having to talk about the health of the mind, because it's one unit. And in order for us to be healthy as individuals, kind of have to eat the right food at the right time, get enough exercise, get adequate sleep. And we need to feel the love and comfort of our family and our community around us. If there's any aspect of that disrupted, most people don't feel well. And then, so the basic things that are beyond our control, that are determinants of human health, are clean air, clean water, healthy soils, a stable climate, and a healthy ecosystem. And climate change disrupts every one of those human determinants. And if we take even just one at a time, if we look at clean air, Australia doesn't have clean air. 3,000 people each year die from breathing in air pollution in Australia. And these numbers are from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, which is a government investigative or statistical body. So, and if you break down air pollution into its bits, air pollution is a large soup of suspended particles, of solid and liquid particles. So if you look at the solid particles, the two particles we look at are 10 microns and 2.5 microns. And what we know is that with the very small 2.5 microns, there's decades of data to show that this causes harm. And it's just the class size, so it's the size, like if you push a Benton puffer and you see all those little droplets come in, they're the smaller droplets that actually you breathe in, it goes down into your lungs. And if this small particle, you breathe in and it goes down your lungs into your bloodstreams in pretty much every single organ. So we know that these microparticles increase the risk of lung disease, lung cancer, heart disease, stroke. We know that increases the risk of type 2 diabetes, impacts on babies growing. So these particles go into our system and cause inflammation, and inflammation, that's the source of the problem. So then you have the larger particles, the 10 microns, that cause sort of snuffy noses, goes into your sinuses. And then we have the liquid particles. So, we measure nitrous dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and the volatile organic compounds. So all these things are measured by the over 80 air quality monitors in New South Wales. So New South Wales has the most number of ambient air quality monitors. So all these things can be tracked.
And are we seeing them going up? Are we seeing?
Yes. So Australia has the poorest standards in terms of their regulations. So we know that we're not the world's best practice in terms of what we allow our population to breathe. On a regular basis, due to air pollution from generating energy, from industry, and from car pollutants, we do get exceedances, and you can actually go through the Environmental Protection Authority website and see it. So we have this, and then during the bushfires, 80% of our population on the eastern side of New South Wales was subjected to 80 days of toxic smoke. And so when I was driving to work, I couldn't see 2 cars ahead of me. When I got to work, even though our building is pretty much sealed, could still smell smoke. And the difficulty is I work with a population of patients who is a broad demographic. I look after a lot of First Nations people. I look after a lot of people who live in houses where they don't have good thermoregulations, are very leaky. So with the toxic smoke, people would have the toxic smoke outside, but then inside their houses, there's also smoke. So my patients who actually have asthma, the little kids with asthma, my patients with heart disease, respiratory disease, I've got quite a few patients with respiratory failure where they are using an oxygen extractor all the time. It's really hard to have nasal prongs in and put a mask on when you go outside. So just the practicality of avoiding the smoke was impossible.
And in fact, that's where we met, didn't we, Kim? We were in an outdoor venue, completely surrounded by smoke.
Right.
So obviously, you're seeing the increase, and the fires is a really great example. And I think all of Australia kind of had a waking moment to the sort of deepening crisis of climate change. Can you talk a little bit about the activism that you've got involved with as a result of what you're seeing?
So I suppose I started unconsciously a long time ago because my family's always lived sustainably. My parents are Buddhists, and we've always had very low energy usage and power usage and water usage. So those 2 things were always precious. So without realizing, I was reducing my carbon footprint for years and years and years. And so I started activism locally in terms of once I actually had a low power bill with all the installation of my house, and then I got my battery and panels, I actually lobbied the council members and asked them to come to my house to see how a sort of a low carbon footprint house was actually livable, and that it was that it's actually joyful to actually grow your own food and actually have your own chickens. And so I started on a really local level. And then I had friends who were with a group called Citizens Climate Lobby. And I joined that group, and the Citizens Climate Lobby specifically trains you to see politicians. And then I joined Doctors for the Environment. So within my advocacy, I advocate at all levels of council. So I've got my own Hills for Climate Action group in my own local area. So we are working on the council and on our local businesses in the area. And then at the state level, I work with Doctors for the Environment. So we lobby state politicians, but we also lobby, and the federals, but we also work on superannuation and banks. So we've got a divestment group, which I'm in. And and then I give community talks, and I've done quite a lot of community talks now. So educating the public about climate change and health, and how you can still contribute, because it's really important, because climate change deepens social inequity. And I think a lot of people don't understand that, especially a lot of people who rely on the market to actually be the savior of this country for climate change. They don't realize if you allow the market systems in place to deal with climate change, you leave a lot of people behind. And this is why I do all my advocacy, because you need mechanisms and policies in place to actually make this fair for everyone. And fairness is such an important thing. And regardless of what spectrum you are in terms of your political leanings, the word fair, most people accept the word fair.
Yeah, that's it. That's a beautiful connection to the conversation we were having earlier about, you know, how the market's not going to solve climate change either. I wonder, this may seem a slightly strange question, but I know a lot of people on this call, and both Gurkum and I come from the performing arts. And there's something I've been thinking about a lot lately about whether people who are not only having to use, using their bodies to express, but are very sensitive because of the creative work that they do, whether you're seeing that there's any more susceptibility to some of these climate change conditions.
Look, heat is the main problem, and global warming is such a significant factor in terms of Australia since 1910 has increased its average temperature by 1.4 degrees. And that 1.4 degrees is the average. Like in Western Sydney, it's 6 to 10 degrees hotter than the rest of Sydney. So if you perform physically, and it's hot and you don't have an indoor environment to perform in, there's only so much that your body can adapt to hot weather. So there's risk of heat stress, heat stroke. And even in a lot of centres, not everywhere is actually air conditioned. Some places are not thermally regulated and they're just fans. If temperatures go above 35 degrees, a fan just doesn't cut it. You need air conditioning. So heat impacts on the most vulnerable, but even the most healthy will be impacted.
Yeah, thank you. If people have questions for Kim, I'm going to move on and also talk to Deborah, but please put any questions you have in the chat because we will get to a Q&A in a little bit. I'd like to just bring Deb into this conversation because you're also an activist, and it would be great for you to just talk a little bit about how you got into activism.
First, hi everybody. I'm zooming in from the land of the Bunurong, Bun Wurrung and Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation. It's great to be here. I'm so really thrilled with this project and these conversations. I haven't been able to attend them in person, but I've listened to all of them and they're awesome. Yes, in answer to the question, I worked in the arts for 16 years, but I worked in development. I did an arts degree. I did an honors arts degree. I was, really enthusiastic about the capacities for the arts to create a better world. And I ended up working with really, awesome organizations, Melbourne Theatre Company, National Gallery of Victoria, the opera, the ballet, Bell Shakespeare Company, really worked in development on a number of these organizations and got incredibly depressed at the commodification, at the ways in which the arts were really being, occupied by the very interests that the arts exist to critique. And in that way of, in a democracy, it's much more difficult, as we know, to silence. In authoritarian systems, they have all sorts of methods. In democracies, it was really interesting to see in the early 90s, this whole narrative, and to start to see the people, and really starting in, the 80s, but by the 90s when I got into it, the people sitting on the boards were fundamentally hostile to the arts, to progressive thinking, to questioning. They liked artists though, because artists, by and large, even very introverted artists, tend to be very deep thinking and interesting people. So you had this kind of culture where the arts were being, really, honored in one way, but also in a very kind of safe, contained way. And what Israel and Nancy were saying, totally grok that. just sitting in board meetings and listening to people in the fossil fuel industries, people with kind of exploitative and extractive mindsets talking about creative activities. And, you know, so the whole nature of creativity, which, you know, ought to be and largely is creative and collaborative and expansive, being really compartmentalized and starved, basically starved. So I got terribly depressed and thought, I'm part of this system and I just can't do it anymore. So I had this wonderful job. I worked at the National Gallery of Victoria. I looked after the NGV Contemporary Group and, you know, donors, high-level donors. But my direct boss really was Hugh Morgan. Do people know Hugh Morgan? Do you remember when Clive Hamilton came out with his book Scorcher, and he had the, you know, he had the Dirty Dozen? Well, Hugh Morgan was like, I think he might have been #1. When Guy Pearce wrote his book, what was that? What was it called? Oh, anyway, I've got to, yeah, I'll put some really good books to read. But he was the one who came up with the Greenhouse Mafia on Four Corners and exposed a whole lot. So he had Hugh Morgan as the team captain, but he had a cricket team. So Hugh Morgan he started the Lavoisa Group. He was instrumental in starting the, or key person in the Institute of Public Affairs. He was with Woodside. So, you know, it was untenable. The idea that you could actually really do good things was, you know, I gave that up.
So what did you do, Deb?
So I had started a climate change action group in the city of Port Phillip called LIVE, Locals into Victoria's Environment, because we had big ambitions. We wanted to kind of link up all sorts of community groups around Victoria. So we came up with this name, and we did some really great work, and we still exist and we still meet up and we're still mad about each other. But we worked out pretty quickly that lobbying our local members really wasn't going to be enough, particularly when we didn't actually have any coal mines in our neighborhood. I still think it's very important, and it served many important purposes, but it wasn't going to cut it. So then a few years later, though this is by 2010, with Guy Abrahams and Fiona Armstrong, who, Kim, you may know of Fiona. She had started the Climate and Health Alliance, CAHA, and a brilliant model for bringing people together to advocate collaboratively. So that was a health sector model. So she and I approached Guy Abrahams, who was a gallerist, a trained lawyer. We actually had connected through the NGV because both of us had ended up at an AGM for the Australian Conservation Foundation. And I got back to my desk, you know, I kind of felt like I had this double life. Anyway, so I got back to my desk at the NGV, and there's this email from Guy saying, was that you at that AGM? I'm like, Guy, are you a secret radical greenie? Oh my God, you know. Anyway, so we all went and had a cup of tea in Richmond, and Fiona and I posed to him that really what he needed to do was to start Climb Art. So he said, yeah, okay, let's give it a shot. If you guys will come on the board, and we still are, and we have, 10 years this year later, and with a significant, in fact, Sarah McConnell, I see, she's recently come on the board as well. We have Gabrielle DeVitri, who's done incredible work on the Maps of Gratitude project. That's something else I'd love to talk about later, actually mapping. People familiar with that project? Mapping all of the fossil fuel industry that sits on boards right through the arts. It's brilliant. I'll put that in the chat. Lauren Rickards, Peter Christoph, Bronwyn Johnson, David Leese, who's an architect, and he also funded, you know, really helped us get off the ground and gave us not only some cash funding, but space in lease in the architects' offices. So we had some really good encouragement. But we also had a very hostile government at the time, so the coalition government. And I mean, I can't begin to tell you what it was like. And in fact, I remember Guy and Bronwyn even had a meeting with, it was then Arts Victoria, and they basically get there, they're in the waiting room and everything, nobody, and they're like, yeah, completely ignored. And they're finally like, yeah, well, we're here to see blah, blah. And they're like, so they've been waiting a while, right? Oh no, I'm sorry, blah, blah, just couldn't make it after all. So sorry about that. You know, like weird mind games. Anyway, the Andrews government came in and really everything changed. And so we started to get a lot more security. But as you guys have discussed, it's still, it has to have, it's been in a very safe place. And I think it's done incredible work in that space, but because it needed to be structured in ways that made it safe for institutions to come on board. And, you know, the funded institutions, we have received some great funding and support from foundations, and we couldn't do anything radical.
So Deb, the Climate Guardians, which is one of the acts, and that's in fact how we met, has had a lot of success working in this activist space, and the link really to Kim's work too is putting your bodies in harm's way in order to raise awareness about the climate crisis. And I'm just wondering, have you been doing anything in recent times? Just one example that gives an indication of that work.
Well, certainly the Climate Guardians, which is a Climax production, we also have some satire acts, that was started with Liz Connor, Dr. Liz Connor, because again, Climate just didn't have the capacity to do the kind of theatrical blockading that I really wanted to do. So, and Liz had done some really, really clever work beforehand with the John Howard's Ladies Auxiliary Fan Club. So they actually intercepted John Howard a few times as 1950s ladies. So, you know, it was fun, and it was also very entertaining, and it's been very effective. But lately, and Dave's here. So Dave's recently been a Climate Guardian, an absolutely gorgeous one. Dave's a performer and a dancer. So, you know, the way he moves in these costumes and just, yeah, it's brilliant. But look, we have blockaded a lot of sites of fossil fuel industries. We've, you know, just on day one when we were let out of lockdown, we were very early, or for us, it felt very early. It was like 8 in the morning. But after being, you know, shuffling around in your pajamas until 4 p.m, it felt like a very early day. But we were there at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and we were singing songs of gratitude to essential workers, which was actually beautiful and really emotional, you know, to see some people move to tears, and just grateful and touched by the appearance. We had reworked with Susan Bamford Cameo, and her friend Alyssa had recorded the music, or actually want to do something with it, because we rewrote lyrics to 3 different songs, and like, we can see clearly now the smog is gone, you know, we can see all oligarchs in our way. You know, so yeah, there was that one, there was Bridge Over Troubled Water, and People Get Ready.
Beautiful.
So, yeah, so some gorgeous songs. But again, can I say too that the fun of the act is, even when we're coal diggers, or we have a kind of carbon baron cable, we have a group of medieval astronomers from the Flat Earth Institute, we have the Frackers Guild. Even when you're in those kind of crazy costumes, what's super fun and exciting about it is the responses from ordinary people. some of our best material is written by people going, oh yeah, well, and everybody gets it.
And I think one of the things that I'm really interested in for this audience is that while in our first part of the conversation, we're talking about the kind of legalities and the problems that are obstructing the arts, there's also an interesting problem in that an activist group like yours is not recognised by the arts. And so there's a really interesting tension for me. I mean, I think that Deb is one of the improvisers, because her way of being able to intervene with politicians, stick to character, and bring in all the various pieces of research that she's done about climate crisis is really, really skilled. And yet there's a bunch of performers who wouldn't accept that she was a performer, and she doesn't call herself a performer. So there's some very interesting kind of ways in which our sector are also not necessarily embracing some of the people who are prepared to, you know, be in legal battles, which Deb has been in a number. So I'd just like to again say, does anyone like to question these very skilled and amazing people? It would be great to have your questions. Gurkham, have you got any questions?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Deborah, could you just in one sentence say what do you think is the most effective role or aim, if you like, of climate art? Like, what's the most effective thing? Yeah.
Of climate art, creating a voice for the arts, because this sector is very potentially hugely powerful, far more powerful, I think, than the arts gives itself credit for. As Dave was saying this morning, we had a bit of a chat, we walked to the market, and you know, everywhere there's art, everything we're wearing, you know, everything, there's art everywhere. And what Pippa was just saying before about how this line between very trained and professional artists, and I very deliberately will not kind of put myself in that capacity at all, because I think it does deserve serious honouring, somebody who's dedicated their career to really studying the arts, and the way that can really benefit. I'm sorry, I've gone off on a tangent.
No, it's great. No, beautiful response. Thank you. Creating a voice for the arts. That sounds great. But I was just going to follow up with the question. And please, we've only got a few minutes here. So if anyone does have questions or comments, please put them in the chat and we'll turn to you, or I can read them out for you. Why do you think we don't see our power? Why do we not see our own power in the arts?
Well, as we were just saying, the arts are everywhere. It's a fully essential part of humanity, how we feel, how we engage, how we connect to all of these issues. It's an issue, it's through emotion and culture, as we've seen. Look, if it was facts and evidence and data and, you know, which we absolutely need, but this issue would have been solved decades ago. This has been, and this is why your program of your talks are so important, because it teases out these issues. Neoliberalism, like, that was just some crazy idea. What a crazy idea was that? And to try and put a price on things that are invaluable, as Kim was saying, you know, we all entirely depend on healthy ecosystems. The human and planetary health are entirely interdependent. You know, the arts is absolutely vital to our humanity. And the other thing before we do go anywhere breaking out, is just to look around at the way that arts have been treated in Australia. And it is nice, I have to say, to be sitting in the radical end of kind of, maybe our group is just exploiting the arts, because the police arrive and, you know, you're in these fabulous costumes and they're like, oh, ladies, you look so lovely. You know, it's harder to arrest a flock of angels. But you know, the other side of it is that you look to Germany, for example, and the euro is a fiat economy. So there are measures to protect, you know, to stabilize interest rates and those sorts of important mechanisms of an economy. Australia is a fiat economy. The federal government, through all of the local arts agencies, could be investing huge amounts into the Australian arts. Like the Australia Institute recently did a great report saying that for $1 million that's invested into the economy, for the construction industry, you're looking at between 0.9 and 1.3 jobs, nearly all male. If the same amount of money is invested in the arts, you're looking at creating 9 jobs, and they're, you know, roughly gender equal. And they're also caring jobs. So all the flow-on benefits through society are so invaluable. So that's when okay. And if we go back to Germany, they've just, even though there's lockdown and, you know, all of the terrible economic consequences that they've had, and they've had death and disease that's, you know, we've been really fortunate to be spared. They are investing, I think it's $1.94 billion this year into their arts sector. Now, it'd be interesting to pull that apart. How much of that is for living artists? How much of that is going through communities? How much is that sustaining, you know, the institutional arts and all of the infrastructure, social infrastructure required? But still, that's pretty cool. Now, the Australian, we're a really rich country. The way that the arts have been treated is just, it's shameful, and it's a source of it's disgraceful.
Well, it's ideological, which is precisely what you discovered when you were working within them. I would suggest. Yeah.
We've had some great comments in the chat. I'll just read out a few. So Megan said, politicians will listen when we unify to become a voice powerful enough to influence voters. And Alex has said, I think we relate to structures the way they present themselves to us rather than on our own terms. Megan's also followed up with, Australian culture has marginalised us as luxury goods for decades, and many of us have internalised that lack of agency. Until Canberra hears a unified voice that will influence voting, we will not be seen or heard. And Megan's last comment was, economic data speaks the loudest to Canberra. We've got a question, I think, here from Robin. I'm interested in the role of the arts inside the climate movement, its role inspiring, challenging and unifying people who are already activists, and in deepening engagement and debate within the movement. Extinction Rebellion is interesting in this regard. Did either of you, Dr. Kim or Deborah, want to respond to that? So, yes, go, please.
Okay, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I love Extinction Rebellion because they're creative and they're fun. So it's because when you're being an advocate, you know, it can be a drag, but if you actually make it a fun place to be and you're just doing something good because you're actually communicating to the people around you, then, you know, people respond to things that are positive. You have a line of bees buzzing around the city, which is what happened in Martin Place. People love it. They respond to it. And we do have a problem with pollinators, and this is one great way to communicate it. So, no, I'm all for Extinction Rebellion. Except as a Doctors for the Environment, I'm not allowed to join Extinction Rebellion.
Actually, yeah, so true, Kim. The Climate Guardians actually, huge privilege. We launched the Extinction Rebellion in Australia. So with our angels and particularly we had two 15-year-old angels who were also, they wore both hats, student strike hat as well, because it was several weeks before the first student strike in Australia. So that was wonderful. And nearly all of our members have participated in Extinction Rebellion things, and some of them are key organisers. But I guess, like Kim, we recognise that what we do is a little bit different, and we've been doing it for a long time, and it's a formula that's worked well for us. We met Pippa, and we actually have done some kind of semi-professional things with her as a result. We also, some curators have worked with us, which has been really great. So we've been careful to to maintain a space that is again something different, because I am all for all the spaces filled, like more street art, you know, more intervening, more just get out there. And as Kim said, you know, it's really fun and it's really great from the material too. Like I was saying earlier, some of our best lines are written by things that people say, and you're like, wow, that's good. I'm going to write that down. What's your name? Tom. Great. No.
Thanks for that. And Kim, I've seen here you've got a comment. I wondered if you wanted to speak to that. It's the way the government views what a real job is, you said. I think you were commenting on
yes.
earlier.
It's sort of a 1950s view of jobs. Like, it's a kind of very white male way of thinking about jobs. So a job in the arts is not a real job. That's why we're doubling your uni fees. So it speaks volumes about the way they view the world now, which is not progressed beyond the 1950s in terms of the way they look at the way society is structured, how we're going to be mainly employed in the service industry, not from the extractive industries. And there's so many people who are in power who don't grasp that.
Norm's put a, thanks for that, Kim. Norm's put a commented, one way to amplify our voice is collaborations with scientists, researchers, technologists, educators, etc. And there's a great symposium that he's put a link into the chat on Arts Front if people want to have a look at that. Did you have any comments on that, Kim?
Oh, so there is, because we work together as a collective, all our groups. So there are big alliances. There's a Northern Sydney Alliance. They've got about 80 groups now, so of all groups. So there's doctors, lawyers, social workers, psychologists, all the local like climate groups. So if we work collaboratively and we are able to communicate with each other, then we don't duplicate and waste time, so that we share information. So we do need to work as a unified advocacy group, really, all of us.
Thanks, Kim. We've just got a couple of minutes left before we move to our breakouts. Deborah, did you have any final comments you'd like to make to any of the points that we just mentioned?
Yes, and I guess it's to back up what Kim was saying. We need to have a very unified voice around what the problems and the solutions are. But then I think the way those voices communicate, you know, the more the merrier, and the more creative, the better, I think. But yeah, no, I would really encourage thinking around how we can really bring the arts forward as a more as a political force, not just for, you know, across all of these realms, because again, they're all intertied, they're interdependent and interconnected. And the health of our mental health, and particularly after COVID, it's there are many opportunities, and I think the arts is it's the best space to be kind of leaping from right now.
Thank you, Deborah. We've just got some final comments here from Liz. From experience in projects with science arts collaborations, scientists are willing to and looking for opportunities to collaborate with artists. Their skills are often limited in terms of translating their knowledge over to the broader public domain. We need more avenues for creatives to link with climate research bodies. Although the epistemological sharing is a valuable process in itself, the products that these collaborations create are tangible cultural experiences that are vehicles for science communication to broader audiences. We might just have to kind of leave that there to take into our breakouts, because we're moving on to that part of the day. But we've got one final comment, and I'll hand to you, Pip. Ray says, you can draw a parallel between the work of artists to the work of stay-at-home parent carers. Their work is essential and invaluable, yet it's not valued by the market, therefore often not recognised as real work. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass back over to Pippa.
Thanks, Gurkhan. I think, fantastic amount of thinking there to take into the breakouts, and we're going to do similarly to what we did last week for those who were with us. We've got a mural board, and I've put the link in the chat for people who like to go and put notes onto whiteboards, but otherwise Gurkum and I will do that, and you can chat amongst yourselves in the breakouts. I'd really like you to think about what you can do, what we can do as a sector, because part of the whole purpose for us of generating these conversations is to try and come up with some action. And also, who can you join? I think I'd like to see that there's clearly a distinction between those who are calling themselves activists and absolutely focused on trying to change conditions and thinking about the climate emergency, and then the role of artists in this space, which may be different. And I think that's an important distinction. So the wonderful people of Arts Front will now split us off into 2 breakout rooms, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts when we come back. If someone, Gurkum and we're back. Gurkum, are you feeding back for your group?
Yeah. Did any of you 3 want to feed back, or do you want me to, Kim, Robin, or Dave? You'd like me to? Yep, sure. Okay. Yeah, look, we had a conversation at the start when we sort of went off on a few tangents, which was, you know, great, but probably not quite to point. But then we did come up with some great actions at the end. Just then, Robin sort of painted a picture for us of a kind of, you know, if money fell from the sky, and if you know, we didn't have COVID restrictions, we could have a national networking, annual national network around art and climate. And then we sort of said, well, actually, that could be done remotely on Zoom anyway. It doesn't need to be a big conference. Perhaps it's something that the artists and the activists as part of Extinction Rebellion might be interested to drive. But it's the idea that to keep that conversation alive and to have more of that networking between artists and activists. Did you want to say anything to that, Robin? Or have I covered it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a fully formed idea anyway. So yes, I think that covers it. Yeah.
Great. And yeah, then the only other one really, I suppose, that we came up with was we were just talking a bit about how, on Deborah's point, about how, you know, that a lot of people on boards of arts companies probably around the world are, or well, in Australia, at least from, you know, from the fossil fuels industry, as Deborah was saying. And it sort of made me think that this sort of feels like being artists as accessories, or being sort of the playthings. And we talked a little bit about how that has actually, you know, progressed to artists being asked to go to balls and lunches with these people, and just to, and I guess what I was thinking about that in terms of an action, I'm not sure if we concretized it as an action, but to just think about actually becoming aware of who, as Deb was saying, that maps of gratitude, I think it was about becoming aware of who are those people on those boards, and sharing that knowledge, like as much as we can, tell each other in the arts that is actually who is on the board, and think about how that impacts us. I think they were probably the 2 main actions we came out with.
Beautiful, thank you. I'm not sure I'm going to do this justice, but I'll give it a go. We started, Raywin was talking about an action that she'd done outside a museum in New Plymouth in New Zealand, and because the museum's funded by the fossil fuel industry. And of course, then there was some pushback from artists because they need that space to be able to present their work. So that tension that is always there really about how do people who are so reliant on the money then get themselves into a position where they can refuse the money, and do we then need to identify people who have some stability, financial stability, to be able to help advocate and model what that looks like. And then Vivian was talking about creative partnerships conversation that she was in this morning, which was talking about, I'm going to paraphrase this badly, I fear, but talking about how arts organisations choose who to partner with in terms of money, and that idea of where and how does the arts have a transition plan, and who could lead on that. And I think that's a really interesting action to come out of this, and I would love to give that a little bit more thought. And then who you would want to invite to that table if you were in charge. And then, is it useful to make a difference between the political and the practical? I think for some people that they're inextricably linked, and then perhaps for others they're not. And that raises questions for me about, you know, one of the things that the arts does so beautifully is that those spaces that are hard to define and that are, you know, the in-between. And then that leads us very beautifully to Alex's point, which is that she was talking about needing to reframe her thinking about this whole issue so that she's enlivened, and that there's an exercise, a choreographer that she's worked with whose name I've forgotten, has a turn your head exercise so that you're constantly, well, this is my interpretation, constantly having to reframe for yourself where your perspective is, and that then is enlivening, but also is not being dictated to by the way that the system is dictating. So let the practice lead us was the kind of rallying call out, which I thought was very beautiful.
If I can just clarify, that the creative partnerships one was about the ethics of sponsorship, the idea of how we as an organisation or industry transition was something I've been working through. So they didn't actually touch on that. They were just sort of responding to their current situation. Thought I'd clarify that. Thanks.
Great. And I wonder if anybody has anything more they'd like to contribute. I mean, I think my final point was to the group, which didn't quite get there, was that we can't wait for the money in order to act on climate. We really, really can't. So that's why I find the enlivening point of Alex is so great and pertinent, because we need to be enlivened in order to move forward on this. And it is overwhelming. I really respect that, even for those of us who are with it all the time. Deb.
Yeah, can I add too, it's really threatening to the arts now. I mean, you know, these are, in the last 10 years, the share price of every fossil fuel industry, you know, company in Australia, every fossil fuel company in Australia, it's the Australian Institute's done some really interesting work. It's about half its value now. So they've looked at all of the investments in the share market in Australia, and if you had any money in the fossil fuel industry, that is halved in value. So for the industry, the arts industry, to be hooked to a dying industry, you know, it puts us in a very vulnerable position as well. So it's being realistic about the myths that are out there, the reality, and I can actually send through some really good Australia Institute research that shows that it's in big trouble. So, you know, we could look at it in another way and say, we're going to do those investors a favor by helping them get off their own addictions and transition forward, because there's no future. There's no future in the industry.
Thank you, Deb.
Vivian's just put in a great question. Can we form a group of people willing to frame a campaign, one that looks at how we can be funded ethically and sustainably?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that is the start of a transition plan, and I think that's really a really exciting idea. The other thing that I missed in our group was talking about the ethical frameworks of projects, or the ethical frameworks of your work. And certainly one of the things that I've found moving out of the arts is to be in a space where that's constantly at the top of every part of the project work that I'm doing. Is like, okay, what are the principles guiding this, and how do we make sure we stick to them? So we're almost at time. Kim, I've got one last question for you. Is there anything that we can do to just ease our bodies in this time of great tension? Because a lot of this conversation is really stressful for people. Do you have tips in terms of simple things we can do? Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, time in nature, if you're near nature. My time in nature is my garden and my chooks. It's because, like, I think everyone in this community, beyond the arts, beyond this community, has been struggled with this year. And we need to find something that brings us joy on a daily basis. So, because we can't have chunks of holiday away now. So in order, so with mine, I do yoga, the garden, time with my children. So
that's lovely. Thank you very much. So thank you especially to Dr. Kim and to Deborah for your contributions today. Thank you everybody for showing up and taking part in the conversation. We really, really value it. Next week, we have a conversation that is a bit more free form, and it's partly that we're going to take some of the action suggestions that have come out of the first 3 conversations and have a bit more discussion about them. I think the idea of a transition plan today is top on my list. That's exciting. And then also to talk about what next. How do we are these sorts of conversations valuable given there's so much to do on the internet at the moment? Are there other things that you'd like to see? I know that both Gurkham and I, and also the team at Artsfront, are very interested in this. So just to finish off and say thank you again, thanks to Artsfront, thanks to our captioners, Ray and Louise. It's been an absolute pleasure, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
thank you. Bye.
Thank you.